So again, I want to welcome you to this open forum discussion. And I want to emphasize what I think will be a really dynamic and interesting and important discussion about loneliness. Loneliness is in some ways a feeling. It's a subjective evaluation that all of us understand at some level. But what we're interested in is the impairment from chronic loneliness and trying to understand the causes and the modifiable aspects of the process that leads to so many people being impaired in their lives and their sense of well-being and their ability to function. And I think it will be very dynamic to think about this complex set of issues from multiple perspectives, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. And I would like each of the panel members to introduce themselves briefly and give you an initial sense of their perspective that they're bringing to this complex set of issues. So, Laurie.
Hey, thanks so much for coming. So I'm Dr. Laurie Santos. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale University, but I'm also a head of college at Yale. So Yale is kind of like Hogwarts and Harry Potter, where it has like Gryffindor and Slytherin and things. And that means I live with students on campus as a head of college. And that was when I saw the mental health crisis really up close and personal. I saw loneliness in the trenches, in this spot where students are supposed to be hanging out with one another in the dining hall. I saw them kind of feeling this awful sense that they just didn't belong and that they just didn't feel connected to others. And so what I did was I retrained in the science of well-being to try to learn what the science says about how we can reduce things like loneliness and other things that impact our well-being. So that's why I'll be talking about today, a little bit of some of the science of what we know about why we might be lonely and what the kinds of things we can do to reduce it.
Hi, I'm Ed Weising. I'm the Director of Policy at the Wellcome Trust, which is a big funder of medical research. I am not a scientist, so I will bring absolutely no scientific insight to this discussion, so I apologise in advance. What we are interested in doing, though, in Wellcome is bringing the world together around mental health. So we want to change the way mental health science works, how we do mental health research, bringing together neuroscientists, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, a whole bunch of other people, but critically to understand how we're going to tackle mental health by looking at what's going on in the world and what is going on with people and how people behave and what people feel, because that is key to mental health. And loneliness is going to be one of those big themes that we'll have to think about. When I think about mental health and I think about loneliness, for me this comes back to a question of belonging and that feeling of belonging. I grew up in the north of England, and discovering my identity in my teenage years as a gay man, I felt no sense of belonging, often with my peers, and I felt very excluded. I know that's not an uncommon experience. I found music for me, and membership of orchestras and bands was the way that I found my sense of belonging. But it feels to me that when we talk about mental health and loneliness, that sense of togetherness, of oneness, is really important to cultivate in building the resilience in mental health. When I look around this week, and thank you to everyone for allowing this circus to come to town, I see these tribes with the badges, and different colour badges means you can get different things. And it really cultivates sometimes a negative sense of belonging, because you're thinking, I'm in that tribe, or I'm in that tribe. And my question really for us, and I hope for all of us, is how can we cultivate this underlying sense of belonging, of looking out for one another? And that sense has been in the discussions we've had all week on mental health. As I say, we're announcing a big program this week, $260 million, to do this research and to invest into it. But how can we make society work so that we can create more belonging as an underpinning sense of tackling loneliness?
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Samuel. I come from Canada. I am founder of the Samuel Center for Social Connectedness. I'm a professor of practice at McGill University, and really delighted to be here on this panel. I love that this is an open session. I love that it's taking place in a school, and I love that you talked about the importance of belonging. I think about belonging a lot. I think that we are all born with a right, which I see as a human right of belonging, really a God-given right of belonging, and yet at many times in our lives we can feel lonely, and we can feel stigmatized or humiliated or ashamed, and I feel that none of that should happen, and that we need to work very hard to prevent it. And yet I see this not as a disease, but as something that is entirely preventable, as long as we have resilience and support each other. So when I look at social isolation, of which I see loneliness as a major component, I've always had in my mind this vision of a person who is sitting all alone at the bottom of a well. Initially, about 20 years ago, I saw that because of my father, who had had a very serious brain injury, was in a coma for 3 months and then a rehabilitation hospital for another 3 months. And when he woke up very slowly, I saw it wasn't about the many disabilities that he had. It was this other pain that was present that came to me to be seen as isolation. And for my mother as his primary caregiver, having been his wife of 40 years, now having this other designation. And I realized that it wasn't because of what had happened to him. It wasn't because of the disabilities. It was because of the way people, even well-meaning people, valued him as being different, and I would say even less than. And so I just decided at that point that I would be spending the rest of my life working on this and teaching and in writing and in spending time with younger people, with older people, and realizing that while we can talk about this and should talk about this in the genre of well-being, in the genre of mental health, that actually this is an experience that I believe is as old as humanity, and that if we value its significance, then we'll really be compelled to do something. Thank you.
For me, loneliness is something which is very personal. I was in therapy most of 2017 and 18 to realize that the root cause of the physical symptoms and the emotional symptoms were loneliness. And it was funny because for me it didn't look like a man sitting on the bottom of the well, because I was in a relationship, I was in an organization, and I was a very confident person. So it looked like I was very happy outside, and little did I know that inside the subtler aspects were lonely. And I was feeling somewhere that the intensity with which I was feeling things were not communicated to anyone around me. And what I've been doing now is looking at bringing some of this work in my work with kids. I'm teaching at a local school back in India, and helping deal with working with kids who are displaced from their communities, such that they build resilience and the language to be able to deal with loneliness, speak about it, speak their inner realities with their peer group, such that they can cope with their situation better. So that's the perspective I look forward to bring.
I run a company called The Empathy Business, and I've started a campaign called The Truth About Technology, because I think despite the promises of the tech companies to bring the world closer, that actually technology is fueling the loneliness and empathy deficit we have in our lives. And like Varun, this is sort of personal to me, although the irony of me bringing my phone on here is not lost to me. So I think I have to admit I am somewhat addicted, maybe like many of us in this room. But this is a really important topic to me personally, because my nephew was the first child in the UK to be diagnosed with games addiction. And my son has a problematic relationship with technology. So I see it all around. And I am worried about that. And the UK is really recognising loneliness for the first time ever. And a lot of that is thanks to an MP, Jo Cox, who was brutally murdered, who has done some great work in the UK, and I'd like to recognise her now. We now in the UK, we have, as of January 2018, we have a Minister of Loneliness, because we know that loneliness is an early predictor of death. They say it's the equivalent physically of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's linked to increased cardiovascular disease. So I think in the UK, we are starting to be aware of that, and that can only be a good thing. So I would like to explore with you today whether technology is really increasing our social interactions or decreasing them, and the impact that has on us and our children.
So that's a wonderful introduction to the complexity and the different dimensions of this set of problems. And I want to unpack this a bit more as a way to ask some deeper questions here, because on one hand, what we've been talking about is a set of subjective feelings. And we say lonely, but of course sadness and loneliness go together. And sadness and loneliness are often responses to loss, feeling diminished as a person, being left out and devalued or disconnected. At the other end of the spectrum, there is literally measurable levels of social connectedness. How many people we interact with, how many people we have a real connection with. And then there's a set of things in the middle, which is a subjective evaluation of being valued that could be separate from just whether you feel moments of deep sadness or whether you feel loneliness or whether you look sad or lonely, that make people feel socially diminished. And this idea that what aspect of these processes, and this is now to form a question, if we want to have an impact into the causes and impairments from this set of problems, what would you focus on? Either as something we need to understand more deeply in terms of causes, or something we need to target to change to decrease the impairment. And again, I'll start again with you, Laurie.
Yeah, so I'll take the perspective of the science of well-being, like some of the things that the science tells us about the things we can do to feel happier. And one of the sad things from this research, sad as a human, not as a scientist, because scientifically it's very interesting, but as a human I'm like, this kind of sucks, is that all the research suggests that for many of the things we go after we're motivated to do, our minds are lying to us about the kinds of things that will make us feel better. Like we just seek out the wrong kinds of stuff. And I think this happens in the domain of social connection. Often we don't realize how nice it would be just to have some time with the people we care about, so we don't seek it out. Often we just don't realize how nice it would be to just make a connection with a stranger, you know, in a line at the bank or in a line like waiting for coffee somewhere. We don't realize how important it is. And there's some lovely empirical work that study this. There's one fantastic study by the researcher Nick Epley, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. And he had this idea that one of the reasons that people tend to feel lonely is that they don't realize that simple conversations with other people might make them feel better. And so he did this funny study of commuters going to work. This is on the L train, a train in Chicago in the US. He went up to people and said, do you want to be in a study? Okay, you have to spend the rest of the train ride either enjoying your solitude, or you have to spend the rest of the train ride talking to some random stranger who's sitting next to you on the train. Like spend the whole train ride talking to them. And so he has people predict, and people predict, maybe like some of you in the audience will predict, because you're looking at me like, what? Which is that talking to the person next to you is just going to be weird. Like it's going to feel too close and kind of it's going to impinge on their privacy, and it's just strange. So people don't do it. But what you find when you force people to talk to someone on the train is that people in that connection condition feel much better afterwards. It improves your positive mood to have that connection. He finds that that positive mood increase occurs even across individuals who report being introverts. Even people who really don't think that it would make them feel better, it actually makes them feel better. And the title of his famous paper is called Mistakenly Seeking Solitude. And that's his idea. We're social animals, but we sometimes forget that we just need to like take action to talk to people and make more connections. So I think one of the hypotheses and one of the things I think that's a challenge is that even when we're feeling lonely, even when we're feeling yucky, we don't realize the right next steps is just to reach out and make these connections. We kind of feel like it won't work in the way that it ultimately will.
Whoever wants to go next. Good. Yes, anyone.
Okay.
We're going to be more dynamic.
Okay. Shall I just go ahead?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Wasn't sure what the ordering was.
Yeah.
I would like to come at this from a different point of view, which is that this doesn't only happen to individuals. And what I mean by that is that groups of people can be othered, isolated, and experience that. And it can be I'm sure it is always a combination of what do I perceive as an individual, but that's going to be greatly affected by the messages that I'm getting from others. And just two brief examples. One, coming from the UK, which probably most of you will have heard about, this horrific fire of Grenfell Tower that happened almost 2 years ago, or about 2 years ago. And this was a social housing complex not far from where I live in London, where I live part of the year. And this is a fire that, in terms of diagnosis, simple diagnosis, well, the cladding was done wrong. It's construction material. Why was it done wrong? I'm oversimplifying this, but I'm correct in saying that the cheapest materials were used. So the cheapest materials were used, and there wasn't sufficient protection for the residents of that community for fire. This is a community that advocated, organized, did all the things that communicated with each other, communicated with local officials, happened to be mostly made up of recent immigrants, mostly made up of people living in poverty, which I define as having many dimensions, and people of color. And when that happened, one of the things that I thought about and have been thinking about ever since is about numbers. And I think about, in terms of numbers, when you look at the about 80 people, I don't think there was ever an exact number, perished. Everyone else was left homeless in that. And yet in terms of the organizing, the metrics, the data that they had about what was needed, all of that was there, but they were not seen as being as the same value. And when I hear a lot about loneliness, people say to me, and social isolation, and in a way, these words can be used somewhat interchangeably, because we're talking about how it feels inside, which tends to be remarkably similar. I'm often told, well, this is your timing is really great because this is a really hot issue right now. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, this is an issue that's as old as humanity. And to go back a bit, some hundreds of years earlier in the UK, looking at what Charles Dickens wrote about the London fire, and what studies show is that in the Great Fire of London, there were about 8 reported deaths. That's almost nothing. Why? Because the only deaths that were reported were of the very poorest people were not. And sorry, I'll come back on that. The poorest people were not counted. There were no numbers. They didn't count. And in one hand, and in the other hand, weren't counted. So I think that's we could look at lots of policy implications, and we look at now at the Grenfell fire. Another example I'll give you is refugees and forced migrants, and I'll draw from an example in the U.S., the community of the first climate refugees, who happened to be in Louisiana, an indigenous population, mostly made up of older persons. And when it came time for something to be done about the land sinking and sinking and sinking, nothing was done. Could have been done, and so eventually the community all had to leave. The government came up with a settlement. I don't know how you ever can compensate people for their way of life, but anyway, it was done, and then took years and years for them to get anything back. So just to say on that this is a collective, and I think my fellow panelists would agree that this is about mental health. It's also about economics, it's about social policy, it's about environment, and I think we really need to look at that systematically.
I was just going to say, I think you're right about it being an old age issue. But also I think what Laurie said is, often what we think is good for us is not actually good for us. And what I'm worried about is that actually technology, it helps us avoid the realities of everyday life. So it's literally like the worst form of therapy you can have, but actually we use it the most. And I'm worried about the next generation not having the skills, the social skills, the empathy skills to recognize that they feel lonely. And that's obviously very different from being alone. And that is a real problem, I think, that we're not teaching our young people empathy. We're not teaching them to recognize or process their own emotions of loneliness. Because actually, a lot of the time, you don't have to face real life when you're on your technology, and I do the same. It's like a comfort blanket. It's like a pacifier. So I think part of what we need to do as a group is kind of recognize loneliness and also make sure that we have the skills to actually deal with it.
I would actually second that, because I think also growing up in India as a man, never learned how to really check in into feelings and emotion. So if someone would ask me how I'm doing, various words of synonyms of fine would just be the learned script. You know, did not realize that those were moments or opportunities to really check in. And when the check-in started, I realized I didn't have the vocabulary, what these beautiful feelings were all about, what these different emotions were about. When that happened, then realized the third stigma, which is around having conversations with this. Because now, you know, and this is also the time I started feeling very jealous of my other gender, because I was like, how is it men never talk? Whom do I go up and say I'm feeling nervous? You know, will I seem too childish? Will I seem too boring? Will I seem too emotional? And I was pretty much feeling that today as I was coming, and I was sharing with Ed. And I was like, but I'm glad that I'm able to check in and just have this conversation with you. But realized that this awareness was missing. And I think, yes, technology completely does not even allow for that pause, check in, and have that 1 minute conversation even.
Have you heard of the men's shed? So the men's shed is a new idea in the UK where men who typically don't want to do therapy, they go into a room and together and make wood. And it's it's like a woodwork studio. And I think part of this debate, and we're going to move on to actions later, is us thinking creatively, because Varun has so openly said he didn't feel comfortable and he didn't have the skills. And I think a lot of us feel like that. So actually, you know, the answer to this is not therapy in its most traditional form, but the men's shed could be a good one for you.
Yeah. Ed?
The men's sheds.
I just wanted to give Ed a chance
yeah.
to.
I'm sorry, so I'll be quite quick. Just two quick things. One really boring, technical, scientific thing. We need more common measures so that we can bring science together around these problems. Often you can see amazing studies being done by psychiatrists, by clinical psychologists, and you can't really compare them because they're looking at completely different measures, and they're saying, okay, I'm looking at this thing, I'm looking at this thing. They're really looking at the same thing, but they're measuring it completely differently. If we're going to bring science together around this, we need common measures. The What Works Wellbeing Centre, I'm sorry there's so many UK examples at the minute. I don't know why that is. Probably because we're all from the UK, which is awful. Anyway, they did a study of well-being and in the existing science, and they said the vast majority of studies into well-being and loneliness were of people over the age of 55. There was relatively little on loneliness in younger people. And what they said was, we desperately need more common measures so that we can, every time someone does a study, we can look at how it fits with other studies. And in Wellcome, that's what we're going to be funding. The other thing I think is really important is leadership. And we've been talking in the Congress Centre with lots of workplace leaders, with people who lead in education, about what they will do to create workplaces, schools, hospitals that tackle mental health in an appropriate way and really make a difference for their own employees. I really felt that when I went from school to university. And there was a leadership at school who frankly sometimes said, I don't like gay people. And I was at an all-boys school. That made me feel pretty rubbish. I then went to university, and it was a group of people who had collectively said, these are the values we are going to have. This is the way we are going to work. And we are going to belong together and look after each other and acknowledge people for who they are and embrace their identity. They made a decision to lead in that way. And I think when we look at loneliness, when we look at mental health, that sense of leadership, of creating schools and workplaces where people do say that from the top and they say, this is the culture we want. It's not the whole answer, because we do need the scientific interventions too, particularly as people get closer to more formal forms of depression and anxiety. But I think if we create those cultures, we can make a big difference too.
So this is great. I want to pick a few threads that have come up in this last round and weave them into another set of questions. Picking up with what you just said, Ed, measurement and uniformity across different approaches is crucial if we're going to make progress at a larger scale. And what goes hand in glove with measures is the concepts, the conceptual framework of what and how we operationalize the construct. And I say that not because it matters about the words, but if we don't have a clear agreement about what aspect of the phenomenon we're trying to measure or change, then we can be spinning our wheels. And so I want to now move to Kim's example that could seem counterintuitive, that collectively people connected could feel something like lonely. And I agree. And the implication of that is feeling diminished or devalued as a group gives a feeling that many of us would say is a lot like loneliness, even though you might be socially connected. And one of my favorite examples, which sounds a little silly, is any town or region or country that is invested in their sports team knows what happens when they lose. I mean, and I have photos from when Brazil lost the World Cup at home, and you would think it was the most horrible people, the tears and crying and weeks of impairment because they felt diminished in a domain that mattered. And this idea, do we matter? Do we matter as individuals? Do we matter as a group of people who are marginalized? Do we matter in a world that's become tech-heavy and exciting and changing at a rapid pace? Are we pushed peripherally? Left out is one of the items on the UCLA loneliness scale, feeling left out. What makes us feel left out? That's very different than just feeling sad. And so all of these aspects of loneliness are important to the larger domain. But I want to push us as a panel to say, if we were going to take a slice into this complexity to try to make change, what aspect of this sadness, loneliness, social value, mattering would you focus on? So, again, go ahead. Laurie's hands up, and she's the...
All of them, now that we're going to get some fantastic funding from Wellcome, all these researchers will be able to do. No, but I'll focus on two of them. One is a thread that I think Ed brought up, which is this thread of belonging, right?
Yes.
And I think one thing that's exciting from the research is how really simple interventions, like just simple things that leaders and organizations can say, can change how much a person feels like they belong. So there's some fantastic work coming out of Stanford. This is from Greg Walton's group that does really simple interventions at the start of a university semester with students. Or right at the start of the semester, they just have them write a quick essay of how much you feel like you matter. Like who cares about you? How do you feel like you belong here? Like what's a domain where you really feel integrated? It's a short essay. Turns out these essays will predict whether or not a student feels like they belong in university months later, even semesters later, like a simple short essay. And so that's why I think belonging could be so important, in part because it's important for this whole phenomena, but also that might be a spot where we can get really fast inroads to make change. A second domain, I think, is just finding ways to feel more socially connected when we're around other people. And this gets back to the thing I was mentioning, Belinda talked about earlier, that we do the wrong kind of stuff when we really want to feel connected. Many of us are often in places with lots of other people where we can really feel isolated. I see this in my college students firsthand. One of the examples I often give is that back when I was in college, the dining hall was like one of the loudest places on campus where everyone was eating and talking and so on. The sad thing nowadays is sometimes I'll go into my dining hall and see a set of students all together, at Yale University, where they're all smart, all the same age, headphones on, like this with their phones, and it's quiet, right? And so I think another quick intervention we can use is finding ways to make the connections with the people who are around us. It's one thing if you're lonely and you just aren't physically around other people. It's another to be physically with a lot of people, but just not making connections. And I think here again is a spot where our minds lie to us, and it picks up on something Varun was saying earlier, where there's attempts to make connections, but we just don't do it very well. How are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. Then we're done. Whereas if I really asked, what upset you today? What were you really feeling? Like if I just try to penetrate a little bit deeper, you can see a lot of effectiveness. The problem is that people feel, kind of like Varun was saying, it'll feel weird, right? You feel, if you admit, no, I'm not fine, like actually I'm feeling terrible, like the person will walk away or there'll be some stigma and so on. I think, again, some of the research is suggesting that this is a lie of our mind, that like when you admit fault, when you admit insecurity, when you admit vulnerability, it actually does a lot to improve connections. It's just not what we think. And so I think that's another spot where we can have an inroad to kind of teach people better strategies to actually connect when you have the opportunity to do it in the right way so that you really feel some closeness there, rather than kind of feel worse when you're talking to people, but you're kind of talking past them.
And I think you've got to connect in a meaningful way. you know, because I think the connections have become so light, haven't they? And, you know, we Brits are very good at doing the I'm fine, you know. So I think the connections have to be deeper and more meaningful. And if we can use technology in that way, because we know that people who feel most lonely have more Facebook friends. You know, how can that be? Because the connections that they've got are superficial and light. And I think we are all wanting to have deep and meaningful connections. And we need to use technology to find that. A couple of examples in I keep talking about the UK, it must be Brexit. We must be all really feeling insecure. I don't know why, but we're using is multi-generational, where you put different generations together. So you get, you know, nurseries in retirement homes. They're starting a pilot scheme where you get the postal workers to check up on people, you know, and we can use technology to kind of, you know, and that's a really positive thing, as opposed to the volume of friends I've got on Facebook, the Instagram, the glorified life, the number of tweets I've done today, because that, to Laurie's point, they're interactions, but they're not deep, they don't enrich our soul, they're not really where we can be vulnerable. And that, I think, is where we've got to push technology, and we've got to push the founders of technology to help us create a space where we can genuinely be ourselves.
I wanted to add to the importance of the science and what I'm going to call the brain, what we know from the brain and the way the brain might lie to us, or looking at examples of technology that can either be beneficial in terms of enriching one's meaningful relationships or work in the opposite way. But I think something that's missing is the heart in this dialogue, that a lot of this is heart-centered, particularly in what it is that we value, what it is that makes us feel worthy in ourselves to actually go picking up on one of your examples, Laurie, I just to actually look at someone when you're talking to them, but also in a heart-centered way to see that person for who they are. And in terms of the aspect of making more social connections, I think that's extremely important. I just want to point out that the socially isolated person, who also, I would argue, lacks agency, may not even feel worthy to go out and make those connections. So I think looking at the root of it is important. And I would just add one idea that my students came up with, actually. So I need to give credit to the students at McGill, is this creation of a charter of belonging. A charter of belonging that can be done in a classroom, that can be done in a company, that can be done in an NGO, that could be done in this room, that could be done in the World Economic Forum, is to agree what it is that each individual in that group, however that group is constructed, even if it's on the train for an hour, what it is that they value most in order to have that sense of well-being, and to write it up and to co-create that is something that's pretty easily done and works.
Great. So just one quick idea about self-image as a thing to look at and think about. So there's a thing called the Millennium Cohort Study, which rolls through and does conclusions about behavior and sort of what we see from that. And they looked at self-image, and they looked at screen time, and they looked at how people are using technology. They found there was a much greater correlation between hours of social media use and depressive symptoms in girls than boys. And then when I put that together with a talk I went to 2 days ago in the forum called The Female Icon, which talked about sources of self-image for teenage girls in a reported survey, so these are reported opinions rather than anything else, that social media was right at the top, magazines were also there, the mirror as a route to self-image was right at the bottom. This sense of what determines and conditions self-image, particularly in adolescence, but not exclusively, and how that is cultivated, and how we as a society can push against it for our greater good, is, I think, a really interesting area both to look at scientifically, but also culturally, and for us to be honest, to start being honest about where the sources of self-image come from, because the answers are not always very pleasant.
I actually looked at it as a spectrum, where there's a certain amount of loneliness, which I also started realizing as healthy. Jitters before a big performance, feeling like being the only representation from whatever community you belong to then feeling left out. And that's where initiatives like the, people coming together and doing an activity in whatever form that is, could come in. And then coming a space where, things like friendship bench or therapy spaces become important, where you have, you are realizing that this being dysfunctional and it's been dysfunctional far too long. It's time I seek, help, seek out to an individual whom I can speak to. And then is also a time when, therapy or clinical intervention can be required. So I look at it as a therapy, as a spectrum. And in terms of where can we get in, I realize for each one of these places there is an intervention that is required. For example, some amount of normalization required in the first spectrum. To realize some amount of loneliness is okay. It's part of the process. If you're doing anything creative, if you're doing anything new, there will be a time when nobody believes in the idea. And for me that was a turning point middle of last year. The other thing, which is, the mid-spectrum, is where things like what Laurie was talking about, more spaces where kids can come together or adolescents can come together and even play without technology, engage for longer conversations like the train ride conversation and so on. So I look at it as the spectrum.
So I want to shift a bit to think about life course, and that there are two areas of the lifespan that have already come up. One is some between adolescence and early adulthood, when mattering and identity and feeling valued, meaning and purpose that's part of the search of that period of lifespan, and rates of loneliness by a variety of measures are increasingly problematic and at a very high level. And then in elderly and middle age and adulthood, again, a big increase in both social isolation and loneliness. And I'd love to have people share some thoughts about particularly important aspects of approaching loneliness in those windows of time, which could also create windows of opportunity for impact. So, and you could pick either, or we could.
I just had a question on that. I mean, I think, does it manifest itself differently, loneliness, amongst different generations? But is it fundamentally the same things that you're talking about, belonging, mattering, feeling important, and getting your voice heard? So would the solutions be different, but fundamentally, is it the same?
So again, I think that's an important question. And I think there are people who would say there are some aspects that are different, and there are probably some aspects that are similar, but I'd love to hear the other people in the panel's thoughts about it.
I typically when there's focus on youth and old age loneliness, I often, when I read it, I laugh for the same thing, because I think there's a focus on loneliness in the way we can perceive it when you are alone, or you are part of a community that has been, say, said, discarded or removed, and that is something which is happening to you. So there is a cause outside of you which has caused that loneliness. Which is easier to see. But I have to agree, in terms of, for me, the area of intervention is the most subtle loneliness, which I think people across generations, people across even social landscapes face. So just knowing that distinction, that one is much more easier to see and perceive, but the second one is, I think, more intense.
Other thoughts about maybe the unique aspects of adolescent and early adulthood loneliness?
But I think, honestly, this gets back to kind of Ed's point that we need more data. We need more sociological data. We need more public health data. We need those folks to be talking to psychologists and neuroscientists who are looking at the mechanisms of this stuff. Because my sense from the data is like, I don't know if it works the same, if the mechanisms are the same, if the cultural changes that have led to increases in all these populations are the same. My guess is that one thing that is similar is that we've seen interesting cultural shifts that I think have affected these different demographics differently. I think kind of the erosion of cultural and religious institutions has really negatively impacted the elderly, who used to have communities around them that are kind of slowly going away, particularly in the US. So I think that that's one cause in the older generations. I think a cause in the younger generations get back to the importance of everything that Belinda's saying, which is that, in many of our kids, even very young kids, they have devices in their pockets that the research suggests might be reducing loneliness to some really interesting extent. And part of it is social media, part of it's those apps and kind of the way they play out and all the things we've talked about. But scarily, research is suggesting that some of it might be the very physical presence of these devices at all. Like the physical presence of your phone, it turns out, this is some lovely research by the researcher Liz Dunn at the University of British Columbia, the physical presence of your phone and having it around makes you smile less at people. So if I code your smiling when you're sitting in a waiting room and you have your phone versus your phone is off somewhere else, you'll smile less when your phone is around you. And you get a sense of why that is, right? Like it's just distracted. You're looking at your phone, you're not looking at other people. Having phones, just the simple presence of a phone reduces your enjoyment of a social conversation at dinner. So all of you who keep your phone out to check the time and you leave it on your dinner table, turns out it's a really bad strategy. It's actually reducing your enjoyment of the conversation. Again, minds are lying, right? We're like, is that really true? Turns out if you look at the data, it's really true. And so I think in the younger generations, and this is younger in kids, but also younger in 20-somethings, right? Like we've put technology in our pockets that could, in ways we don't realize, be reducing parts of our social interaction that we used to really value. And this is a cultural shift that's happening pretty universally. And I think we don't know the consequences of it. Belinda mentioned that we need to push the founders of technology to think more about what they've done. I agree with that a lot. Like we might really start needing to think about the potential for regulation of some of these devices because we don't really know what they're doing. We at least need more science to understand how they work and how they're affecting us.
Can I just make one
Sure.
quick point on that? Because I think it's also the purpose of the tech founders. So the CEO of Netflix, he said his number one competition wasn't other broadcasters, it was sleep. And it's kind of funny, but actually, if you think about it deeply, it's really not, because ultimately, how can a purpose of a tech company be to reduce our sleep? Like I've binge watched, we've all binge watched our favorite shows, and we enjoy that. But it's that purpose has to change in line with what society needs. And I think if we as a group can hold these technology companies to account, Steve Jobs didn't let his children play on iPads, but they're very willing for us to have as many devices as we can. So I do think we need to challenge them. I don't know if regulation is the answer. I have a different view, and that's probably for a different panel. But I do feel that actually we have to ask the right questions and say, we're not going to accept it anymore.
Kim, you were.
Yeah, I wanted to address older people, which was I think the other part of your question. When we think of older people, I'm not putting an age on that, and I think that one of the reasons that we see so much othering and perhaps loneliness and isolation of older people is this tendency to devalue someone based on their birthday. And as a friend of mine, Bethany Brown, who's in charge of older persons' rights at Human Rights Watch, says, I call bullshit on that. I think that with older people, while we can look at the valid points you made, Laurie, about the breakdown, even in families, and I still think that we have an ethical issue to get over, and one of the ways to do that is to ask ourselves, what do we value, and also, if that isn't enough, or to underscore that, is to come at it not only from the very important point of science and research, but also human rights, because where we see isolation, we often see abuses of human rights, and this could be in any age, of course, but since you'd asked about older people, I would give the example of older people in nursing homes who didn't choose to be there and aren't treated very well, or older people who are hungry and don't have enough food. This is getting into rights, not simply be nice to grandma or grandpa.
So A couple comments linking together parts of this, and then we're going to shift to giving the audience a chance to ask some questions. I do want to suggest this, one of the themes that's emerging that connects to this idea of adolescence and the elderly is that when we keep coming back to mattering and social value and purpose, I think that one of the things that we understand about adolescence and early adulthood, that is the developmental task, finding meaning, purpose, identity, and being extra sensitive to social evaluation and then trying to manage that on your Instagram account. So I think that the idea that the process of finding meaning and connection and purpose, which is the fundamental task of transitioning to adulthood, and then losing value as we age, having society be biased implicitly or explicitly in policies to feel less valued. And so I think these are probably amplifying other factors that we think are important and maybe suggest some targets. So I would love at this point to open up for the audience. If you want to direct the question toward an individual panel member or just throw it out. And we have microphones. And I saw the first hand I see is back here on, yes. And say who you are and then just ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Christian Ležaj. I'm coming from Croatia. So just to address you, I was also crying when Croatia lost in the final against France, but somehow it turned out into a joy when they came back, the footballers. A question to Ms. Parmar or any of the other panelists who I really appreciate being here and listening to this. So there's a lot of talking about technology taking over. People will lose their jobs because autonomy is gonna, in a way, take over. So how do you see, is there a way that technology and happiness can coexist in 5 to 10 years in a way that, that not necessarily that it has a negative impact, because technology is not gonna stop developing, and it will have a big impact on taking over some of the processes which are done now by humans. So how do you see this unfolding, and will it create even more loneliness? And maybe what are the ways to address this? Thank you very much.
So I think it's a great question about technology in the future, and I am optimistic about technology. I want to, I love technology. My former company was called Lady Geek, so I am a geek at heart. So in terms of automation and the future of work, I mean, some industries, you're right, 25% in the finance industry of jobs will be automated. But the question is, when you look at what type of jobs will be automated, is often they are the very monotonous skills. And actually, if you look at what machines can do, it kind of goes back to what Kim said about heart. The skills that we need in our future workforce are creativity, judgment, empathy, innovation, because no machine can do that. So I think the future looks good as long as we practice those skills. People think, oh, you're born with empathy or you're not. Actually, 50% of your empathy skills are taught. 50% they think is genetic, but the rest is environment and practicing it. So I would say I'm excited, but are we training for these skills? Are we valuing? And then to Ed's point, are we really measuring these skills? Because they will be the ones that people want in jobs.
Could I
Oh, sure.
Very briefly, I'm sorry, I keep going on. At Wellcome, we're looking at this too. So we're looking at technology enabling us to do more and more. And we're looking at a world where people are then working more and more and their well-being is decreasing. In Wellcome, we're looking at whether the right answer for us is to move to having a 4-day week rather than a 5-day week for the organisation. Because we know that the well-being, other organisations who've tried it, well-being tends to be higher. People tend to be more focused with the time that they have in the office. And then critically, that 5th day, people tend to develop new forms of empathy and new forms of cultivating their own empathy and practicing that. One really interesting thing that we've had as we've been discussing it around Wellcome, and we haven't decided it yet, are a lot of people saying, oh my goodness, I love the idea, but I am terrified about what I'm going to do on my day off. I feel that no one else is going to be working, everyone else is going to be working, I'm going to be sitting there alone, what am I going to do? And I think it's a challenge that we're throwing back to the organisation. And it feels to me a little bit like when you talk about retirement and all those days opening up, this wonderful vista in front of you. It is terrifying. I talked to my parents about this. They've just retired. They're doing well, but it was scary. And I think there is something about saying, use time to cultivate empathy and practice empathy, and think about how your workplace and the patterns of your workplace may enable others to do so. And for me, that's the answer of how we're going to coexist with technology that enables us to do more, but a world in which we want to do things productively rather than just a lot.
Hi, this is Alyssa Epple from UCSF. I really appreciate your having a panel on loneliness to highlight the epidemic here, and I appreciate these interesting perspectives from a cross-sector panel. From the research world, which is very conservative with a high bar, there are no interventions that work for loneliness that are validated and accepted. I would love to hear from the panel how you think about big ways of changing both culture and changing human behavior through policy changes. How can we have these big changes in this epidemic? Because as Laurie said, it's not going to come down to a clinical intervention.
So, good.
I mean, one thing is to really think about the structure of how we interact, right? Think about how we can create spaces for people to really have these conversations. And I think one of the things that Ed just said, I think, is going to be important. You know, if I survey my college students will say, I want to meet up with my friends, but I just don't have any time. And I think another thing that's an epidemic, we're talking about the epidemic of loneliness, but another thing that's an epidemic is our time famine right now. You know, we're literally starving for time. And I think that's true in young people, even more so than it was just 10 years ago. And so one of the things I would think to do in terms of policy would be exactly the kind of thing Ed was suggesting, which is like, how can we give people more time so that they can actually have time to make connections? You know, if you think about the friends in your life that you might not have had a chance to call recently, it might not necessarily because your mind lied to you, you wouldn't get something out of that. You just didn't have time, right? We're not prioritizing it. So allowing people to feel less famished for time can potentially increase our social connection. And there's actually some work on this in these experimental contexts. If you give people a little sense of extra time, you can actually do these little things where you prime them to think they have more time. They spend that extra time being social and talking to people and so on. And so it sounds like a kind of funny policy intervention for loneliness, like give people more time, but I actually think that could have a much bigger effect than we think.
I'd like to respond to that as well. Thank you very much for raising policy. I think that all of this comes down to what kind of policy interventions can be made, and how can they be made. I would say right across from interventions for policy, to eradicate poverty, for policies in terms of refugees, policies in terms of environmental conservation and sustainability. Really, just about anywhere you can think of. And what needs to happen, in my view, is not to create a new silo where we say this is the loneliness silo, or this is the we could even sub-silo today. This is the loneliness, this is the isolation, this is the stigma, the shame, the humiliation side, or put them together and probably get nowhere. But better to prevail upon the leaders at all levels, municipal levels, regional, national, and certainly in terms of big global organizations, and come up with probably not one measure, but many. I think there's more content around inclusion and exclusion where we could actually show numbers and to show the costs, which can be demonstrated not only of smoking 30 cigarettes a day, which is although we shouldn't be smoking anyway, so right, but to be able to look at what the costs are of not having policies that are inclusive, and to look at ones that work and ones that don't work. So I would say that policies that don't work, there are many of those. It's hard to find national policies that do work, but on the don't, I would say I would ask all of us to look at what could be changed in terms of forced migrants and coming into countries with quotas and then being told, actually, we'd like to send you away or to an island, or you can bring in families, but not your young men, and to look at what happens when policies like those are made in terms of creating, in my view, much more populism, othering, anger, and consider the cost of not doing what I would say is the right thing.
Yep.
Can
So-
I just add something very quickly
Okay.
on that? I mean, I think we need to be impatient. I think we need some intentionality for change. So yeah, we don't have the research, we don't have the causalities and all of these things, but we have common sense. You know, so whether I would say, let's do stuff, whether it's a minister of loneliness or whether you think that would never work in your own country, I don't know. The friendship bench is such a lovely idea. It's been a real focal point here. Let's get out, let's do it, let's talk, but we need some intentionality. I think we've got to stop talking about these problems and actually start experimenting, as Laurie said, with these small things, because who knows, you know, some 10 small actions could change someone's life.
I'd absolutely second that. I think, especially on this platform, Davos, we focus on the big things, wait for the results to come, and then create a policy, and then work for the implementation, and then look at the problems that created.
A working group, another working group.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is something which all of us at some point in our lives have faced, and you know, all of us, for a problem like this, all of us have the power in our own capacity to do something. It's not climate change; it's something more personal.
Spot on.
Yeah.
Good. Another question over here? No, go to the other side, yeah.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Allaire. I'm a tech entrepreneur in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm interested to hear you comment on the relationship between loneliness and addiction, and both how addiction, both behavioral and chemical and others, lead people into places of isolation and loneliness, and so are kind of mutually reinforcing. But also how feelings of, you know, self-worth or isolation actually heighten and grow addiction issues, which I think when we talk about like the cascading long-term health issues and the correlations with things like cardiovascular issues and death and the like, addiction actually magnifies that pretty dramatically. And so how do you think about the relationship between those? And as we think about interventions as well, are we often seeing loneliness and highly correlated with addiction behaviors, and should they be treated in an integrated way?
I can speak to the isolation part of it, where there's quite a bit of research and over a lot of time about the linkage between addiction and isolation, suggesting that the isolation comes before the addiction. Which kind of makes sense, you know, when you think about it. If you are experiencing some big gaps somewhere, or more darkness than light, metaphorically, or the bottom of the well, where are you going to reach to? And it can often be places that take you away, even if you can't really get away. There's also, I don't know if this would be of interest, but there's also quite a lot done, of research done about recruiting for violent extremism, where tends to go to appeal to, and often the way we advertising attracts us to something that we maybe wouldn't have even been attracted to anyway, to go to young people who may feel for one reason or another that they don't belong, they don't fit in, they're not worthy, and they're ripe for this.
Can I just comment quickly, or do you want to move on?
Let's go into some other questions. Either.
Hello, my name is Natalie. I live in Egypt and I have a 6-year-old. And unfortunately, I've been noticing that the technology addiction starts much earlier than I've hoped. My 6-year-old prefers the iPad over going out for play. I host play dates where kids come with their iPads. And I'm always faced with this question where, why is it bad for me? And I never know what to really answer because they're so young. But I was hoping to get some answers.
I mean, the real answer for like, is it bad for them? I mean, I think the answer is like, we don't actually know yet, right? Like, you know, to study how like the long-term effects of smartphone technology and swiping as a 6-year-old, we need to go back when your son is 30, you know, and see what his loneliness looks like then, or his empathy and so on. And I think sadly, like, these technologies have not been around long enough for us to have the real research on how they're affecting us, which is scary because we don't know how these things are affecting us, but they're literally in the pockets of 6 billion people. So the real answer research-wise is like, realistically, we don't know. There have not been that many studies. But anecdotally, what a lot of folks suggest is the kind of thing that you're seeing, which is like, these things are really attractive. They're built to be attractive. They're built to get our attention in a way that like human interaction is not. You know, I would like to think that I'm more interesting than every cat video on YouTube and every little game out there. But, you know, I try to be interesting, but I'm not. And so I think even though we don't have the research, I share this worry that we've created technology that works in part because it drags our attention. And it's going to drag our attention more than the other people around us. And I think it's a scary thought to think, what would it look like for kids growing up with this? That said, we don't have any research. And this is the same thing that folks said about television in my generation. They said, oh, you know, when I was a 4-year-old watching television, I was never going to be built to connect with other people and so on. And that didn't seem to be the case. I think it would just be great, and we just need more research to know what's really going on.
Can I build on that? Oh, go on, Ed.
So just a lot of this discussion is echoing what my partner shouts at me at home all the time. So this is great. Put down the phones, put down the iPad. So thank you for channeling my home life. I think the thing that I'm told at home a lot, which is not scientific, but resonates for me, is the difference between mindless and mindful activity, and how technology brings us closer to mindless activity. The idea that, and it must be more damaging for children, the idea that you spend time on a screen just flicking around. Cat videos is a great example. YouTube is a great example. Click, 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 click. And you're not really thinking about what you're doing. You're allowing time to pass. And before you know it, an hour has gone by. And that's the way a lot of us, I know I do sometimes, use technology in that way. That is very different to the mindful activity of saying, I am going to build this train set or build a block of stone or whatever it might be. And you have a goal, you have a purpose, you have a thing that you're doing. I think, for me, that is something that technology does disrupt more than other things. I think it is possible to have mindful engagement with technology, but I think it's quite hard. And in a way, I would say, not based on any science, if you can make sure you engage mindfully with technology, you probably stand a better chance of having a healthier relationship with it.
And I think the question, though, is technology good or bad? I think the point is it's neither. It's not neutral. You know, its objective is to get your son, my son, you know, so enthralled that it becomes so powerful. And I find as a mum, as my children have got older, they're 11 and 12 now, so when they're 6, you can actually remove a device quite easily. What happens, as we've all talked about with the phone, is it's part of the belonging and what Ron talks about, which is about feeling that you matter. It's part of your identity. And for a lot of people here, a lot of people that we spoke to this morning, you know, the removal of the device is where the conflict happens. And one of the mums this morning, she said removing her daughter's phone was like literally taking her lung out. That's how her daughter felt. So when they're smaller, I think you have a lot more, it's so much easier. But as Laurie said, the dopamine hit, you know, it's so powerful. So I think the fact that you're asking the question is great. There are no answers, but I'm not going to wait for the science, because I could be waiting 40 years. I don't want our children to be the guinea pigs, the experiments. And actually, the smoking thing is important, because when you went to the doctors in the 50s and 60s and said, you know, I'm feeling a bit stressed, the doctor would say, have a cigarette and calm down. So I'm not going to wait for the research. The fact we're having this debate is wonderful. I think you're doing brilliantly, and I think it's an ongoing challenge for every single parent.
So, and I will add that I think it's very important that we recognize that the quality of and the particular, rather than say technology or screen, really to think about what are the better or worse ways that promote the kind of learning. Because again, we may be faced with horrendous influences we don't recognize. We need to be thoughtful of that. And there were people that worried that reading was a mindless activity. It was going to interfere with memory. And so I think it's not like reading. It's compelling attention. And yet I think there are ways that could be promoting learning. And we need to think about the better ways to introduce technology as well as just to say, that's the problem. But I want to have time for a few more questions. Back in the back.
Well, my name is Nadine Beck, and I'm Swiss, and I live in the States, and I'm a mom, and I'm the youngest of 5, and by quite a bit. And my siblings have been older, so I was kind of, my mom had done it all, and I was kind of lonely in a big family because everybody else was already going their way, and I was home alone and playing in the basement with lots of toys and being lonely. And the thing is not I think if your kids are on the iPad it's if you share the iPads with your kids. It's painful to watch Family Guy with my 15-year-old, but I do it. And then you watch Family Guy and you laugh, and then you can maybe have a conversation about something else. The problem is if you leave those kids alone and you don't interact with them with what they like to do, and then you can't just come in and say, now done with your iPad. It's just, you have to be a little clever and think and watch Family Guy and laugh, even though it's painful or whatever, and then get your kid to different subjects. And sometimes we watch very interesting things that I didn't know, and I learn a lot. So technology doesn't have to be bad. You just have to use it the right way.
That's right.
Here.
Hi, I'm Emiliana Simon Thomas from the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. Thank you for your distinguished perspectives and stories. I wanted to follow up on the idea of empathy. Mr. Gupta, I was really struck by your description of loneliness being about not being able to really name your own emotional experience. And many people have used the word empathy, and empathy is sort of housed in this space of what many people call emotional intelligence. Do you think that emotional intelligence in some way is something of an antidote to loneliness? There's ways that training your emotional intelligence could be a way to be less vulnerable to loneliness, both as the person who is lonely or the person who is treating others in a way that would leave them lonely?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
I could share. Absolutely. I think for me, just that feeling of it's okay was such a big relief. And now in my work, as I'm creating those spaces, I think there is this otherization that even naming these sigmas do, because there is this normalization, and anyone who's outside this is, different. One of the things I realized is even this research on these different attributes, like calling loneliness also as a mental health, is very new. Maybe a few years back, this was normalized. I am someone who is nostalgic of the older times, and I feel some of it was better because at least if I was feeling that way, maybe I was not an othered and there was no term for my condition. Yes, having a term helps because then there can be concepts like empathy that can come in to treat it, but even sometimes not having that helps because then I feel normal. So absolutely, I think empathy is a big one for receiving treatment and giving treatment.
So we have 5 minutes left, and I want to wrap up by I'm going to ask each of the panelists to answer a very practical, action-oriented question, and that is that if you had control over the $260 million that the Wellcome Trust is going to devote to impacting mental health, and you had the freedom to focus on this set of issues around loneliness in the broad way and the impairment epidemic-related issues, what would you focus on as your priority and why? Very briefly. And we'll go the other direction this time, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm just writing it. Okay. Well, thank you, Wellcome Trust, for giving us, I think we're all very grateful here. I think I would look at a couple of things. I think one is tech-related, is about having much more deep and meaningful connections as opposed to the volume of that. I think the second thing is the emotional intelligence and empathy, kind of, talking about empathy, labeling the emotions, talking with our children about empathy, and teaching it is really important. And then I do love this idea of the multi-generational, kind of bringing loneliness. It is actually bringing diverse groups of people together so that they can then, create their own strategies and ways to think about loneliness. So that, for me, is an exciting space to explore.
Thank you.
For me, starting with education, I think some of these subjects of playtime and art time used to be part of the curriculum but never looked at. These were pretty much times when kids were on their own. I think these could be spaces where these kind of conversations come in very naturally and they are taught. Imagine our time where we are making something and then we are talking about it. Could be the start of checking in on the emotional, could be the start of also building that empathy space. And I would invest that money there.
Kim?
I would begin by saying to everybody listening that you are not alone. We all feel this way at some point. We all belong, and it does get better. I would quote Maya Angelou, one of my favorite poets, who wrote, "None of us, but none of us can make it out here alone." So coming from that to the awareness and what you shared, I wouldn't focus so much about the money. I'd focus on what I've learned from you more, which is through your own story and the deep listening that you are doing, and I'm sure that your colleagues are doing around the world. And just as we saw and are seeing and can actually sit in the friendship bench, and hopefully that idea of having something that's low-hanging fruit and practical, where both the carer, designated carer, and the designated recipient of that care understand the reciprocity between both of them, and all of us to increase our resilience would be, for me, come down to one word: education. So I would encourage you to keep doing what you're doing and to reach as many local communities and listen to their solutions and implement them.
Thank you.
So thank you. I have a free pass in this because we already made up. So I'm going to put an invitation to the room to take part in rigorous, peer-reviewed, scientific experiment and investigation in about 2 minutes' time. So we are all quite a mixed community here. We come from lots of backgrounds, some people with badges, some people not. You can blame us for being 5 minutes late to the thing you have next, whatever it might be: lunch, lessons, forum activities. Why not just turn to someone sitting next to you that you don't know, and why don't you ask them one question? What do you think? What do you think about loneliness? What do you think about mental health? What matters to you? And maybe let's take 5 minutes just to listen to each other. You can do it sitting in your seat. You can do it as you walk out. I urge you to take 5 minutes, not 1 minute over it, and to genuinely listen, and also to talk to the person next to you who you've never met before. Hopefully you can find one language to work in, and that could be interesting. But it's an invitation to come with us, to do something we've been talking about, and we think this will make a difference to the belonging that we feel in this room.
I love that, but before we do that, could we get the last comment, because there's a time-sensitive issue for her.
Yes. I love that. And empirically, even if you're forecasting that it's going to be weird, it's going to be great. That's what the research says. But I think in my approach, I think we both need empirical science on what's working. We need to understand the mechanisms to come up with solutions. But I think Belinda's also right. We just need to try stuff. We need to try different kinds of interventions. But I would hope that all of those, if I had a lot of money, all of those would be interventions that we were doing randomized controlled testing on. They'd be evidence-based. We want to try something, but test it at the same time to make sure it's working.
Great. So I think this is a perfect time to do two things. Number one, we're going to close the session officially and thank this amazing panel and the audience. And then everyone should take the 5 minutes and have a meaningful connection with someone you don't know, as Ed invited us to do, thinking about what you would want to do in your own lives or in someone else's life to address this issue. Thank you very much.